and welcome to the Yale Center Beijing, especially a big welcome to Dr. Stephen Roach, who just flew from the US very recently and is in town for the China Development Forum. Welcome to this talk on his new book, Accidental Conflict, America, China, and the Clash of False Narratives, co-organized by the Yale Club of Beijing and the Yale Center Beijing. This is also part of the Greenberg Distinguished Colloquium Series, as well as the Yale University Press Find Your Next Great Read series. I am Carol Lee Rafferty. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Center Beijing and also a Yale College alumna. And for those of you who may be new to the center, we are Yale University's only university-wide center outside of the US, and throughout the year we host events and programs such as these, where we convene thought leaders from all sectors to discuss the most important issues facing our world. Today we are so delighted and honored to have Dr. Stephen Roach with us, and to welcome him back as one of our first speakers here at the center. This is the book that he'll be talking about today, and in this book, which the Financial Times selected as one of the best books of 2022 in economics, he describes the current status of Sino-US relations, the disastrous toll that the conflict escalation has taken on both countries, and proposes a new roadmap to restoring mutually advantageous relations. So hopefully we'll have a really great discussion about this. Dr. Stephen Roach, whom many of you know, is one of Wall Street's most influential economists. He was the former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. Right now he is the senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center at the Yale Law School. His opinion has influenced and shaped policy debates in Beijing as in Washington, D.C., and he is the author of many articles and books, including today's book, Accidental Conflict, as well as Unbalanced, which was also published by the Yale University Press. I highly recommend that you all get a copy. But for 5 lucky people today who asked questions during our Q&A session, Dr. Roach has very kindly and generously given 5 books. So the rest of you, please buy his book, which is a great book. So today's talk will go as follows. Dr. Roach will be giving his presentation. I will then moderate a Q&A session. And we really look forward to this to be an open, candid, and meaningful discussion. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Stephen Roach. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thank you, Carol. And excuse me. It is great to be back here. Be back in the Yale Center Beijing, but basically to be back in China for the first time in a little over 3 years. It wasn't easy to get here, but I'm here and looking forward to a very engaging several days at the China Development Forum. I'm here to talk about the book, but my message is really much more than just another book. We are facing an acute problem with the growing conflict between the United States and China. A problem that I think will be the biggest geostrategic challenge that the world will have to face in the first half of the 21st century, and it is incumbent upon both nations to find a way out before it is too late. So the trend of the past 5 years is clearly very ominous. We've been in a trade war that quickly morphed into a tech war and is now in the early stages of a new Cold War. Cold Wars, by definition, are dangerous because they are precarious enough, contentious enough to turn into a hot war if both nations do not take actions to temper their potential for kinetic conflict. In the past 7 weeks, the pace of conflict escalation has accelerated dramatically further, starting with the balloon fiasco of early February, followed a couple of weeks later by an unfortunate confrontation between the two senior diplomats of both countries, Wang Yi in China and Antony Blinken of the United States at the Munich Security Conference. We had a couple of weeks after that the first of what are now two very contentious, very disconcerting hearings by the new House Committee in the U.S. Congress Select Committee focused on China. And 2 weeks ago, Monday, or I should say a week ago, this past Monday, Xi Jinping, on the sidelines of the National People's Congress, was very outspoken in focusing directly and explicitly on the United States as a source of containment and suppression that could threaten China's development aspirations. So, with the conflict escalating the way it has over the past 5 years, and especially over the past 7 weeks, there's legitimate reason for concern. My message to you tonight that I believe strongly in, that is developed in this book, is that America does not have a China problem. And conversely, China does not have an America problem. But more importantly, both nations have a relationship problem between each other. This is a book about a deteriorating relationship between two nations, and it's a relationship problem that, to be addressed effectively, will require a relationship solution. One nation cannot impose its will on the other, and vice versa. We both have to come together to find a mutually agreeable framework of conflict resolution. So, I will take you through some of the highlights of the book, and I want to focus on, most importantly, my plan for conflict resolution from the standpoint of this relationship framework that I developed in this book. So the book itself is comes in 4 parts. There are 14 chapters. It's sort of balanced in starting out with 3 chapters on developing the history of this relationship. And then it moves into 8 chapters, equally balanced between the U.S. side and the Chinese side, on the false narratives that have driven conflict. Just a word on false narratives. Why am I focusing on false narratives? It's a simple reason. My diagnosis of the problem for both countries is remarkably similar. Both the United States and China, contrary to what you hear about the strong bravado coming from leaders in both nations, are surprisingly vulnerable. They both have problems that they have not successfully addressed, social problems, economic problems, and even political problems in this country. But rather than face up to their own vulnerabilities, and I'll describe some of them, they prefer instead to blame their problems on others. And blame is an inherent symptom of a dysfunctional, codependent relationship. I'll get into that in just a second. But the false narratives come out of that blame, and they are destructive, and they lead to a dangerous condition of escalating conflict that could lead, if not addressed effectively, to a hot war. The final part of the book, Dueling Narratives, brings these two strains of analysis together, bringing the false narratives that the U.S. holds of China, the false narratives that China holds of the U.S., together in the real-world interplay of conflict escalation. I didn't want to end the book on that dark note. It's a great sort of horror movie if it would end on that point. So I felt compelled to take that conclusion of the dangers of conflict escalation into a plan for resolving the conflict. And it's one person's plan. There are many who have other ideas, but this is a plan to put the relationship on a more constructive path. And I welcome your feedback when I get to it. So the first part, which took me a year to write, is summarized on this one slide. It always makes you feel good that you can work for a year on something and boil it down to a few bullet points in a picture. But it breaks the changing relationship between the United States and China into three distinct phases. One, the initial phase, a marriage of convenience that began with President Nixon's extraordinary first trip to China in 1972, then reinforced by Deng Xiaoping's visit to the United States in 1979, where the two nations came together both in need of new solutions to their economic, social, and political problems. China was still, in the early 70s, nearing the end of the Cultural Revolution, as you know, and the U.S. was in a period of growing racial and social unrest, reinforced by a difficult, challenging economic condition known as stagflation, slowing growth, rising unemployment, and sharply elevated inflation. China needed a new solution. America needed a new solution, and they provided one another with opportunities to address their problems. As the relationship deepened, the United States and China became more and more dependent on one another. I call that a codependency. The book that Carol held up earlier, Unbalanced, describes, there she is again, that codependency in great detail. It was a constructive codependency for the better part of 25 years. The U.S. needed China because China provided cheap, increasingly high-quality products that helped American consumers whose incomes were under pressure to make ends meet. China also is the largest foreign buyer of U.S. Treasury securities, which helped the United States fund its budget deficit. And China became, over time, the third largest and most rapidly growing export market that benefited American manufacturers. The other side of the relationship was hugely beneficial for China. America quickly became China's largest source of external demand, which was a powerful prop to extraordinarily rapid economic growth in China. The codependency was strong and enabled both nations to come out of a difficult period that both had experienced in the 1970s and early 1980s. Codependent human relationships are eventually unstable. Partners depend too much on one another, and when one partner changes the terms of engagement, the other partner feels lost, scorned, and starts to lash out. That's true of human pathology. It's a stretch to leap from human pathology to relationships between nations, but it's a stretch worth taking, which is what I do in this book. And when that happens, the codependency then gets transformed into the conflict phase of the relationship, which is where we are right now. The conflict itself, though, is not stable because the blame, the scapegoating, the animosity, the insecurity feeds on each other over time. And what's different about the current situation relative to other periods of difficult relationship dynamics between nations is it is exacerbated by social media. And I spend a lot of time in the third chapter of the book describing the destructive role that social media plays in the viral dissemination of false narratives. And I draw heavily on the work of behavioral economists, especially my Yale colleague Robert Shiller, who's written a brilliant book on narrative economics. And one of the things that he found, which really I focused on a lot in the book, is that because of the rapid spread of narratives, false narratives through social media, that even when the false narrative is revealed to be false, fact-checked by reality, that the false impression endures and overwhelms the correction by truth. And so, a false narrative is a very dangerous and destructive aspect of the relationship dynamic that I address. What are the false narratives I'm talking about? There are 8 chapters in them, 4 each on the Chinese side and the U.S. side. I want to illustrate 2 of them, one on the U.S. side and one on the Chinese side, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. The first one, illustrated by a list of names in the upper right, that the print is so small, it's designed that you cannot read it, so don't even try to read it. But what it is that this is a list of countries that the U.S. runs trade deficits with. When I wrote the book, I had the numbers for 2021. They're the same as the numbers for 2022, which this slide updates. Last year, we ran trade deficits with 106 countries. Now, the narrative in the United States, driven by our political leadership, is we have a terrible foreign trade deficit problem. The biggest source of the deficit is with China, and therefore China is to blame for inflicting hardship on American workers through a wide range of unfair trading practices. And that was the justification, in fact, that former President Trump used to impose high tariffs on China in 2018 and 2019 that China immediately retaliated with, that triggered a trade war that is still ongoing today. Why is it a false narrative? It's a false narrative because our trade deficit is a problem that America is responsible for itself. We have a very low domestic savings rate. And this is where I do economics. I'm an economist. And when nations don't save enough and they want to grow, they have to import surplus savings from abroad. And in doing that, they have to run large balance of payments deficits, which drive the multilateral trade deficit with many, many countries. We close down trade with one of them, but we don't save. That piece of the deficit that gets reduced, in this case, it has been reduced against China, gets diverted to other countries. And the overall trade deficit continues to rise, which in fact is exactly what happens. So we have a trade deficit, yes. We blame it on China. That misses the point that we are responsible for the trade deficit. So it's a false narrative. Lower right, one of my favorite false narratives of China that is directed at the United States, China's failed economic rebalancing. The red line is the consumption share of the Chinese GDP. It's less than 40% today. That number is far, far too low for sustainable economic growth. China's attempted for the last 17 or 18 years to rebalance its economy, shift to more of a consumer-led growth model, but it has failed to do that, largely because it has not enacted the reforms that are required to boost the social safety net, which provides Chinese families with the financial security to convert their labor income, which is growing rapidly, into discretionary consumption. A week ago Monday, Xi Jinping blamed that on the United States, saying that the U.S. Policies of suppression and containment, which by the way are very real, that's exactly what the U.S. is trying to do right now, which is most unfortunate. He's saying that the impact of those policies is to constrain China's rise and development. This is what's constraining China's rise and development, the failed consumer-led rebalancing. China's responsible for that, not the United States. A very important false narrative that China has with respect to America. The book concludes with an effort on my part to bring both sets of false narratives together. They don't exist in a vacuum. So I look at what the combination of false narratives on the U.S. side and on the Chinese side, how they intersect, interact, and reinforce one another. And I do that from the standpoint of the the economic models in the two nations, the role that the state plays in supporting economic activity in both nations, the different approaches to innovation, which has become a central and very contentious issue of the tech war right now, the application of power in controlling the domestic economy, domestic political system, in the case of China, and projecting that power overseas, both the United States and China. And then I look at the what I call the duality of truth, the role that both nations play in controlling information. It's pretty obvious in China what state-directed censorship accomplishes. The government filters literally everything, as you all know better than I do. But we have a comparable problem in the United States where our information is distorted through our polarized political system. Example being the big lie of the stolen, rigged 2020 presidential election. We still have over half of one of our major political parties who believes the big lie of the stolen, rigged 2020 election. Is that any better than state-directed censorship? That's a controversial point. I've been criticized roundly in the United States for drawing what has been called a false equivalency, but I believe the two are strikingly comparable. Now, I have a few charts here that go into some issues that I raised with respect to Chinese growth prospects. In the interest of time and continuity and continuing the focus on the conflict, I'm going to skip over these and come back to them at the end if you have questions about the Chinese growth outlook. So, the point of pulling the dueling false narratives together is essential to the theory of accidental conflict. You know, the false narratives on both sides as they reinforce one another through their economic systems, the role of the state, the projection of power, distortion of information, essentially create this high-octane fuel of conflict escalation. False narratives that feed on one another and are politically expedient for political leaders in both systems to embrace and project. And when you have this high-octane fuel of conflict escalation, it's easily combustible. And so it doesn't take much of a spark to ignite the fuel. And that's the risk of accidental conflict, that the high-octane fuel gets ignited and the Cold War turns into a kinetic hot war. That was the risk in the first Cold War, and it's, I think, just as compelling and urgent a risk in this second Cold War. There are plenty of sparks right now. Think Taiwan. Think South China Sea. The war in Ukraine. I mean, earlier this week, with images all over the world of two dear friends embracing in Moscow. That doesn't go over too well on the other side of the conflict. I can tell you that right now. And The U.S. Congress, for its part, has become a potential spark to conflict escalation on the U.S. side. This House Select Committee on China, I like to call it the House Select Committee on China bashing, has really elevated the negative bipartisan discourse against China to a degree we have not seen in the halls of the U.S. Congress, I would say, since the early 1950s, when we had a committee in the U.S. House of Representatives called the House Committee on Un-American Activity that led to a syndrome of what we call red baiting, seeking out communist sympathizers in all walks of American life, persecuting and ruining their lives, led eventually by a U.S. senator who ended up being censured, Senator Joe McCarthy from the state of Wisconsin. And then, another spark that I think a lot about is the risk of a global recession. And how might that be a spark that ignites the high-octane fuel of conflict escalation? Global recessions are invariably accompanied by blame. No one nation wants to accept responsibility from triggering a global downturn. And so as we saw in 2008, and we saw again in the brief COVID shock of early 2020, there's a lot of finger pointing and blame. And in an environment where the high octane fuel of conflict escalation is growing, that too could be a spark. And just the latest installment of that risk came again earlier this week with the second largest bank failure in the United States, Silicon Valley Bank. An outgrowth of monetary policy mistakes made by the Federal Reserve, compounded by a horrible mistake they made in the surveillance of distressed financial institutions. The U.S. could go into another banking crisis. And if we do that at a time when Chinese partnership with the Russian Federation is growing, the risks of a Cold War turning hot might even grow. And I have an article coming out, I was trying to check, it may be out right now, that describes that potential risk. So what do we do? How do we get out of this mess? A few broad guidelines for trying to frame a framework of conflict resolution, noted on the right-hand side of this slide. 4 points to underscore here. One, the most obvious, the most important, and the one that is missing right now, trust. There is no trust between the United States and China. Zero. And that in itself is a great danger. So I will shortly give you a trust list, things that can be done easily and then not so easily in rebuilding trust. Without trust, we will get nowhere. Secondly, contrary to the rhetoric you hear in Beijing, we need guardrails. Guardrails are being misinterpreted in China as another U.S. plan to hold back and contain China. Guardrails are simply warning lights that go off when problems occur that threaten the relationship. We need to be honest and frank and open about knowing when those times occur. Thirdly, we need to break away from policy actions that look at imbalances between nations as a zero-sum calculus. That's a trap that creates conflict between nations. We've got to open it up and look at positive sum options, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. And fourth and finally, we need a new architecture of engagement. We used to have once or twice a year, depending on the administration, these big summits between the U.S. and China, known as strategic and economic dialogues. They were twice a year under the second Bush administration, once a year under Obama. A lot of people got together for a few weeks and figured out how to set the agenda and stage, big events around the gathering. They were long on headlines, but they accomplished zero, nothing. And they were suspended when Donald Trump came into office. The only real engagement we have right now occurs sporadically when our leaders or sometimes senior officials get together for leader-to-leader meetings, either virtually or, as we saw last November 14th, for about 3.5 hours in Bali, Indonesia. Again, the problem with that approach, I'm not trying to discourage leader-to-leader contact, but it's not a continual framework of engagement, and I'll propose to you an option that is very different and potentially more promising. So trust, step one. Without this, forget it. There are easy things to do on trust. There are not so easy things to do, and there are difficult things to do on trust. But we must be frank and open about laying out the agenda of possibilities. And we have to start somewhere. So imagine, a big apple tree. The first thing you do when you see an apple tree loaded with apples is you pick the low-hanging fruits. They're easy to pick. And then when they're gone, you take out a ladder and you start climbing up the tree and going for the fruits that are harder to reach. And the low-hanging fruit, not difficult to do at all, quite honestly. Reopen closed consulates, Chengdu, Houston. Loosen visa requirements in both countries. China claims it's loosened its visa requirement for U.S. visitors. I had a 10-year visa, multiple entry. It got canceled, and you have no idea what I had to do to get my visa reinstated, and I ended up with a single entry visa that will expire when I leave next Tuesday night. That's not an easy process, nor is entry into this country easy, given still the COVID protocols that exist in China, even in this regime of post-zero COVID. Restarting student foreign exchange programs, very important. And then somewhat higher on the tree, relaxing very severe restrictions on the operations of non-governmental organizations like NGOs. This is a key vehicle to incentivize cultural engagement between our two peoples, and absolutely essential for reestablishing the connectivity of trust building. And then at the top of the tree are the biggest issues of all. The issues that truly affect the future of the United States and China, and you might say the future of the world, if not humanity. Climate change. global health, cybersecurity. We must come together. Neither nation can come up with its own nation-specific solution to these global problems. We must do that together. And when we work together to achieve resolution of those issues, that's really the cement that binds us to the future. If we can make progress in trust, then there are other things that we can do to lead us down the path of conflict resolution. Whoops, wrong way. The second step is to focus on pro-growth initiatives that benefit both countries. And by that I mean specifically reopening negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty which lowers the barriers of entry that multinationals in both countries have to each other's markets. That is far preferable to the approach that has been taken in recent years, initiated by President Trump, and still very much the focus of President Biden's administration, the so-called Phase 1 trade accord, which focused on a narrowing of the bilateral U.S.-China trade deficit as a means to fix the problems that were squeezing American companies, workers, and communities. The Phase 1 trade deal, which thankfully expired at the end of 2022, was a total failure. It accomplished zero. Trump, of course, said it was the greatest deal in the history of deals. But the chart, which is a little complicated to read, on the lower left, basically shows two sets of lines. The dashed red line, which was the target of boosting Chinese purchases of U.S.-made goods by $200 billion over 2 years, and then the black line below it is what happened. And the promise to boost the black line to the red line by $200 billion failed by, guess what? $200 billion. I mean, it was ludicrous. And meanwhile, the U.S. trade deficit, while all this fixation on Phase 1 got larger and larger, the Chinese piece was in fact diverted to other producers like Vietnam, Japan, Mexico, Germany, and Taiwan. So you want to move from a framework that is inherently conflict prone, like Phase 1, to one that is more growth oriented, like a bilateral investment treaty. And by the way, when you negotiate a bilateral investment treaty, and China has more, call them BITs, than any nation, the U.S. also has a lot of them in place, you can negotiate important structural side issues that allow you to deal with very contentious problems like technology transfer, subsidies to SOEs, even cyber protocols. So it's I think, a far more preferable approach. The final step is the one that I think is most unique in my approach, and that is recognizing that the way in which we communicate the architecture of engagement is seriously flawed today, and it is in desperate need of repair. So what I propose is a permanent, the establishment of a new permanent organization that I call a U.S.-China Secretariat, staffed by an equal number of Chinese and American professionals located in a neutral venue, call it Switzerland, or any other neutral venue, that does not work on relationship issues, once a year or twice a year, or staff them up just before a leader-to-leader meeting, but does it full-time, 24/7, and works in a collaborative, commingled basis. The Secretariat has broad functionality, as you can see on the right, in 4 areas. 1, framing the relationship, developing policy white papers co-authored by the Chinese and the American side, based on commonly acceptable database that underpins collaborative research. The Secretariat has a convening function to bring experts in from around the world when there's a difficult problem to solve. COVID is an obvious example of that. Rather than point fingers at one another over the COVID origins debate, which is hugely divisive and contentious, bring together at the onset of this horrific pandemic experts from around the world, scientists, epidemiologists, public health practitioners, to figure out the best way to deal with this lethal virus. It could have avoided the tragedy that afflicted both the U.S. and China and most other countries around the world. There's an important outreach function of the Secretariat, communicating relationship opportunities, benefits, and impediments to the rest of the world, and being open and transparent in providing that information and its underlying data to the world community, so that it too can partner with the Secretariat in understanding the complexities of this relationship. And finally, the Secretariat has an oversight and compliance function to help with the implementation and monitoring of existing and new agreements, where we reach agreement on a bilateral investment treaty, and a conflict resolution mechanism to serve as a way to address the inevitable frictions that come between nations when they are committed to these complex agreements. So that's my plan. Trust building first and foremost, a bilateral investment treaty, and a new Secretariat. And it's not perfect. I will be the first to admit that. But it's a plan. And I think we need more people focused on conflict resolution rather than conflict escalation. And this plan is designed from a relationship perspective. There's not a U.S. approach that says, China, you must do X, Y, and Z, and there's not a Chinese approach that says, America, you must do X, Y, and Z. Each one of my 3 legs of the stool requires mutual reinforcement and mutual support to implement. And so I'll just wind it up at this point and then turn it over to Q&A. I spent 3 years writing the book. It takes a lot of time out of your life to do this. But there you go. The conclusion that I draw from the book is that we are on a treacherous path, and there is a risk of this conflict turning into a major accident for the reasons that I outlined to you this evening. If that were to occur, it would be a great tragedy for the world. It's an accident that would not have happened were it not for the false narratives that both surprisingly vulnerable nations embrace with respect to one another. And as I present this book to audiences around the world, I'm struck with a couple of reactions. The reaction in this part of the world, and I've made this presentation a few times in the last few days already in China. I was in Hong Kong a month ago. I've done a lot of Zoom presentations elsewhere in Asia. The reaction out here is generally on the positive side. I mean, I would not say, unanimous, everything is perfect, but clearly, willing to work within the framework of what I laid out to you this evening. I've made countless presentations on the U.S. side, and the reaction, to sum it up in the U.S., is basically, you've got to be kidding me. No interest. Zero. So that energizes me, motivates me to continue to speak out and speak up. When I see what goes on in the United States Congress today, I'm appalled. There is not one sitting member of the U.S. House of Representatives or the United States Senate who wants to stand up in favor of re-engagement with China. Not one. And when you speak out, as I do, and as a few others do, you get accused of almost being treasonous in this poisonous atmosphere in the United States. And I'm determined to continue to speak out. The business community, which has always been outspoken in support of a constructive relationship between the United States and China, their silence is deafening. They won't say anything. They're also afraid of the political pressure. So this is a critical point. It's time to speak up and lay out the prospects of what happens if we don't. And I'll stop on that note and be delighted to entertain your questions.